Hello students! Today we are going to talk about one of the most useful things that I share in any of my classes. This should be useful to you in all of your classes, definitely the psych class. We're going to talk about study tips. So you've already read the chapter on some of the study tips in there. Today we're going to talk more about cognitive psychology and how it teaches us how our brain works and how to use the limitations and benefits of how our brain works to remember things for longer, to do better on exams, to do better in jobs, to do better in life in general. So this is really relevant if you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. So a lot of these tips can work. I'll say this many times during the lecture. With these tips, try a bunch out. Figure out what works best for you, because for anybody, whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, some of these study tips will work, some of them won't. So figure out the ones that work for you and then use them in your school, in your work, trying to remember phone numbers or your grocery list, those kinds of things. So it's a really, really useful set of tips to go over. So I really love this chapter. I try to kind of infuse this kind of material into a lot of my classes, but I'm really glad to be able to have a really big focus on it in this class. So let's talk about some study tips. To do that, let's first talk about the fact that we forget things. So humans tend to forget a lot of the things that we take in. So let's say I had a lecture where I went over every single question on the exam. So let's say there's 100 questions on an exam. So this is just imagining, pretend. So I go over all 100 of those questions. It takes about an hour to go over that material. Within about 20 minutes after that class, you'll probably only remember about like 58 of those questions. So that's a big drop off. Let's say you haven't heard this material before. I just go over the answers to the exam. Within about an hour, you've forgotten over 50% of what you've learned. So whether it's this lecture right now, a lecture in another class, a meeting with a supervisor, something like that, a movie you've watched, within about an hour, you forget about half of what you went through your brain from that material. So the facts that I share in this class, the facts about the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, you'll probably forget a lot of this within the next hour. So with that being said, you continue to slowly forget things, but the most forgetting happens pretty immediately and then kind of tapers off. Within about a month, anything that you remember from that one instance, so from that one meeting, from our lecture about the exam, from this lecture, anything that you've remembered for about 30 days, you're probably going to remember that forever. So that's pretty well in long-term memory. You see, within about the first day, most of those things are in long-term memory. Some of those things will still be forgotten. So the biggest thing that we have to worry about is this immediate drop-off in forgetting within a day or two, that you're forgetting a lot of the material that you learned. If you can remember it past that 2 days, then you'll be able to remember it for a long time after that, probably. So let's talk about how we can maximize remembering things. So one of the best ways to do this is to relearn that information again, because that essentially restarts that forgetting curve, but makes it less and less intense every single time. So this is when you first learn it, in a couple days you forgot most of it. But if you review it the second day, you remember a lot more of it. Or if you review it another time a few days later, you can see how each of these slopes gets a little less steep. So you can get to the point, if you've reviewed material 4 or 5 times, that you're probably remembering like 80% of that material. So that's one of the reasons that I always ask students to read before coming to class, because then you're getting most of the material once. Maybe it's the day before class, maybe it's even the day of class. But in any case, maybe it's a few days before class. But it gives you another period of time covering that material to give you at least 2 of these things. So it evens out that slope. You'll forget less of it. You'll have more things that it connects to from the lecture in class. So reading before coming to class can really help when you're in class writing notes, and we'll talk about how to do good notes in a minute. And then reviewing your notes. Reviewing a lecture recording like this one, it's pretty easy. You just pull up the video again, you watch it again. In other classes, I record the lecture audio. You could review that. But a big thing is review your notes. Review the things you wrote down. Do that a couple times in good even spaces, because that lets this slope be less dramatic. All right, so with this, we often have a problem with planning, with figuring out how long it will take to do things. So we really underestimate how much time it's going to take to complete a task successfully. For example, I get a review back on my dissertation, like change this, 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 and I look at that and I'm like, oh yeah, I can finish that in 8 hours of work. And then it's 3 days later and I'm only half done. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I did not expect this task or these tasks to take that long. Another one that happens to me, car maintenance or motorcycle maintenance. I'm like, oh yeah, I've done the oil changes before. I'm sure getting the car lifted, getting the oil filter and drain plug out and then put back in, torquing them down, that's going to take an hour, and then it takes 3. And that's on a good day. So we do a really bad job at planning our time and knowing how much time it will take to complete something successfully. So the more you do something, the better you'll get at planning. But generally things will take a lot more time than you are expecting that they will take. So making a good lecture, for example, generally takes about 4 times as much time as I plan. I might think, well, I can make a really good lecture for one class period in about 2 days. 3 to 4 days later, then it's finally done at the quality level I expect. So with this problem can be worse if you are neurodivergent. So if you have ADHD, for example, you might plan on things and be like, oh, I can be motivated and get this done, but you might not be able to as quickly as you expect. Maybe finding that motivation and getting that task started or sticking with it and getting it finished might be difficult for you. And this can be a challenge for people who are neurotypical as well. So with this, do try to plan your time every semester, but have that in mind that things are going to take longer than you expect. So look at your syllabus, look at the schedules professors provide to you, try to plan out your assignments, see if there's weeks that are going to be really heavy for multiple classes, if there's going to be weeks that are going to be really heavy for work. Maybe you have like some review coming up that you have to get done. So plan out a schedule every semester at least. And try to plan extra time for things like studying for an exam or studying and doing a paper, things like that. Budget that into your time. So for a 3 credit hour class, the idea is for this 3 credit hour class, you'll be here in the classroom, so doing these kind of class activities that are active and engaged for about 3 hours, but you should budget for about 3 hours outside of class as well. So with that being an in-person class, that would be about 3 hours of classroom time and 3 hours of outside classroom time. That outside classroom time would be things like reading the textbook and working on your paper, those kinds of things. So, but what other responsibilities do you have as a student? So you've got classes. What other things? Maybe write down for a minute a couple things that you have responsibilities for. All right, so hopefully you thought of a couple things, maybe even wrote down a few other responsibilities that you have. So with that, you might have work. You might have multiple jobs. You might have weekly meetings with family members. You want to hang out with friends. You probably have to go grocery shopping or do laundry. And don't forget, you probably need to sleep as well. We'll talk about sleep as a study skill as well. So these are all things that you need to plan into your time any given semester. So if you have work, if you have family responsibilities, if you want to do other things, plan that into your schedule. Make a budget, and remember, things like doing your schoolwork is probably going to take a little longer than you expect. So this kind of 3 credit hours should be about 6 hours per week. So budget that for your classes. So for any 3 credit hour class, budget about 6 hours a week. So, and then definitely don't forget to sleep. Have a regular sleep schedule. I've had students that sleep twice a day. A lot of people sleep just the one time a day in a big chunk, or sometimes it's a little chunk. I've also had colleagues that sleep 4 times a day, so they sleep like 2-hour chunks 4 times a day. I couldn't work my time and schedule around that. But yeah, I've met people who've done that. So with that, don't forget to sleep, don't forget to manage it. So remember things like commuting as well. budget that into your time. So manage your time that way. Use these guidelines to help you make a schedule for using your time and being able to get the tasks done that you need to, like an oil change or studying for an exam or a paper. So let's talk about reading. When you sit down to read the textbook, when we've got a couple for this class, most students don't read very well, very effectively. So most students read really quickly and they read too shallowly. Oftentimes you've got so many things to read, so many things to do, that you might just skim a chapter. So that can lead to you not taking in as much information. So while you might read 100% of a chapter or skim 100% of the chapter, you're only taking in maybe 70% of that chapter. And then that 70% is the stuff that you start to forget. So in the end, you might be only retaining about 10% of that chapter. And that's not very good if you're not reviewing and doing these other skills. So part of this is planning, poor planning on students' part, not managing time. With this, some students don't read very well because they see, say, a lecture slide. So we're going through the slideshow right now. They say, well, that's going to cover everything in the content. In some classes it might. Generally in my classes, it does cover most of the reading, but I focus on things that I think are not covered well. I bring in things that I don't think were included at all. I focus on things that I think are the most important, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't read as well, because you're getting additional pieces, additional examples. So lecture slides are a supplement to your reading. You should always be reading first before your classes, and then coming with questions, building your notes, so writing notes as you read, then building on those notes during a lecture. So lecture slides are a supplement. They shouldn't replace your chapter reading. So read before class. Give yourself time to reflect. I know it might be hard to budget your time to be able to read one day and then have the class the next day. Maybe you're trying to read in the hour before you do a class period. But do try to give yourself reflection time. That will help with this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, so you forget less because you're re-reviewing that material. So have a day separating this. Find personal connections to the reading. They might have examples that really resonate with you or that make a lot of sense to you. Create your own examples out of the reading to write in your notes in your own words. Don't just copy, say, definitions or the way things are talked about in the book, but put it in your own words, explain it on your own to yourself, because your future self will be reading and reviewing these notes. So highlighting, we've found from a lot of studies, doesn't really help in your reading. So with that, if it's a digital book, you can get a lot of free programs that let you take notes on, say, a PDF or an EPUB book. You can also take paper notes as you're reading from a screen. In a physical book, highlighting won't really help very much, but taking notes, say, in the margins or in a notebook, that can work really well. But avoid highlighting. It doesn't really do any good. So physical books do tend to be better. Humans tend to just remember things better from a physical book. A lot of that comes down to spatial awareness, connecting memories. So all sorts of different pieces of your brain are working in creating memories. So your sense of hearing, your sense of smell, your visual system, these are all working together as they're creating a memory. So if you're reading a physical book, I don't have the textbook right near me right now, but imagine I do. A physical book, the words in a specific section about the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve will be on a specific page in a specific position on that page. So with that, your brain will remember that positioning on the page. This goes for handwritten notes too. You'll remember where you wrote that on the page. And so we actually remember better when we read physical books. Now, I really like digital books. I read most any book on Kindle or my computer screen, so I don't really follow my own guidance on this. But for things that are really important, I do like to put them in, say, a PDF format so that it doesn't change the formatting on a page and I'm not scrolling through, I'm going page by page. That can really help. So when I read really important articles that I know I really need to remember in the future, I do use some of this knowledge of cognitive psychology and how we remember things to try and input that and to give myself that little bit of an edge. So do use that for a little bit of an edge as well. So notes help a lot more than highlighting. I just mentioned this. Even notes and margins, if that's something that you like to do, can be more helpful than, say, just highlighting. So let's talk about note-taking specifically. I know it's unfortunate. It's quick and easy for a lot of you, especially with doing an online class. You're probably really well versed and really used to taking notes on a computer, but handwritten notes tend to be more effective than typed notes. So I'm sorry to let you know that, but handwriting notes tends to help you remember more. Even when you don't review the notes, you'll tend to remember more than if you type your notes. Typing notes isn't a bad option as long as you're taking good notes, but there's a couple reasons that we do worse when typing notes rather than handwriting notes. So typing notes tend to be faster. So we type a lot quicker than we generally handwrite. For you it might be different, but people on average type quicker than they can write by hand. So oftentimes during a lecture or a meeting, people typing notes will just type verbatim. They'll type the whole sentence that people are saying rather than pulling out the key information that you might have to do when you're writing it by hand. And that's a big difference. So writing notes, you tend to be more carefully selecting the pieces of information you need to remember. So basically when you're handwriting notes, more areas of the brain are working. You're paying attention, you're listening, you're thinking about, well, is this most important? Is this most important? Does this example make most sense to me? How does this connect to other material? You're doing that more when handwriting notes because what you put down on the paper needs to be useful. So you also have that area of your brain, the visual perceptual system, saying, oh, I'm putting this note on this part of the page, or it's in this upper corner, or it's in this bottom corner. And you'll remember that. As you go through taking a test, you might literally see in your mind's eye where that note was on your page to be able to recall it easier. So handwritten notes are better than typed notes, so I do recommend handwritten notes. You can get programs and devices to turn handwritten notes into paper notes. I have a little, this is an older device. I really want to get something better now. Oh, the camera's not picking it up. So this device, oh, I disappeared. This device I can draw things on, and it, anyway, it's a note-taking thing that I can save as PDFs. So it doesn't make it searchable though. There's a lot of newer ones that you can actually search and it can translate handwritten writing into text that you can read in, say, a word processor. So those are really nice too. So then you kind of get the best of both worlds. You can have it maybe saved as a PDF or a Word document, but you're actually writing it by hand, and you can even have a complete scan of what you've done. But written notes better than typed notes, so I'd recommend that. So with this, with note taking, come back and add new examples. So remember that Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So you forget a lot really quickly. So if you read one day, then you go to class the next day, and you're writing notes both of those times, you're adding to the notes. Day 3 or day 4, you can come back to those notes and reread your notes on the chapter and the lecture. So you've now reviewed things multiple times. If you come up with new examples in the meantime, you can add those into your notes. So giving yourself space in your notes to add new examples, especially as you say study for an exam or something like that, or make connections to future material in later chapters, that can be really, really useful. I often like to write really, really tiny in my handwritten notes. It's actually better to write a little bit bigger to give space so you can make more notes later. So make meaning in notes. So make sure the notes that you're taking are meaningful to you. The examples that you're putting in there are relevant to you. So if I mention an example about my family, come up with a similar example about your family. It'll be easier for you to remember. So make connections to other classes, other topics. So that will help you remember, because then your memory of the new topic is connected to old topic. And then future topics are connected to this topic and that topic. So it helps your brain make a lot of connections, and that's essentially how memories work, is connecting a lot of systems together to help activate memories. So it's giving you a little edge when you're remembering things. So with that, some notes might not be necessary. So depending on your class, this class, for example, open note, open book. Most of my classes I generally run if I ever use this lecture for a future class, and that's not the case. Sorry, for some reason I changed that at this point, and I will probably let you know why I've changed that. But generally, I have open notes, open book for my exams. So if you need to know the exact specific definition of something in word for word perfect format, you might not need to write that in notes. You can put your own definition of how to understand this concept. So attachment, you can write it in your own words, and then if you need the exact specific definition, in my class, you can probably go to the book and see that exact specific definition if you're wavering between like choice A and B. So depends on the kind of class, so you might need to adjust your note taking depending on the class, so making sure it's meaningful. Because in my class, having the exact specific word for word definitions, probably not the most use of your time for your note taking. Probably a few more meaningful things to do, like put the definition of attachment in your own words so you can understand and review it later. So another thing is how to study in general. Just making sure my recording is still going. Sometimes I get paranoid that it's not. So the binge method is one that a lot of students tend to use, especially a lot of new students. So freshmen, sophomores might still be trying to binge study right before an exam. So they haven't come to classes, or they haven't read the book, or they haven't done notes, or they've missed multiple class periods. And then the day before the exam, or a few hours before the exam, they try to pack in and binge all their studying all at once, and then go and put all that information into the exam. That's not going to be the best method because, like we learned from the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, we tend to forget about 50% of what we've learned within an hour. So if this is an online exam that you can take immediately after you finish studying, you might not fall into that trap as badly. But if you have to, say, go to a testing center or go for a bathroom break before you start the exam, you're going to have forgotten more. So the binge method is not a really useful way to do it. With this being said, I have used the binge method before. When I was a freshman, actually, I had a biology class that it was a useful class. Some of the things have stuck with me and were relevant in learning about like the biology of the brain and how neurons work. So it was a useful class, but I didn't like going to it. So I would often skip that class. And that was my choice. I made that choice. I would turn in assignments online oftentimes. There was a few times I tried to like pass a paper under a professor's door rather than go and turn it in class. I did not do very well for that class. Anyway, with this, I had missed a couple classes. Maybe there was 5 classes in between an exam and another exam. So I'd missed like 3 of those classes out of 5. And so I decided, well, you know what? The exam opens or closes. I don't remember if I procrastinated till the end or tried to do it at the beginning. Anyway, I was like, I will take it at this time. So I will stay up all night. And that's another problem, is I tried to stay up all night. I didn't budget sleep into this. So I stayed up all night. I studied. I read for the first time all of those 5 chapters or whatever it was. I looked at notes from other students. And so I spent maybe 12 hours studying, went to take this exam, and I didn't do very well. Part of that was I did have to take this exam in a testing center. Testing center line is 40 minutes long, so by the time I actually got there sitting down to take the exam, it had been about 2 hours since I had last read any material for this class or reviewed anything. I was very tired, and I didn't remember hardly anything that I had spent that whole 12 hours trying to study. Which, if I had budgeted it out, done these tips that I'm giving you, I'm sure I would have done well. So I tried this binge method. It doesn't work. So space out your learning. It's kind of a key theme here. The Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, we can overcome that and know that that's how our brains work. Spacing our learning out is what we should do. So with this, one way to do that when you're budgeting your time, you can set an interval of time every day to study. So let's say you plan 30 minutes a day to study for this class, 30 minutes a day to study for another class. So do that every day for 2 weeks before an exam, for example. And so any day your given tasks might be different. So you might know, oh, for this 30 minutes, today I need to be reading the next chapter, or today I need to be working on a discussion board post, or today I need to be studying for an exam. Today I'm just going to review my notes. So any given day it might be different, but that's one way to do it, is to budget yourself every day or every other day to be working on course content. So you can also do it by knowing, oh, I do have an exam coming up, so I should give myself an hour for this class and 0 hours for another class for a day or two. So you can do it that way too. So this gives you less stress overall. Yes, you have to plan in advance. You've got to try to stick to that plan. But in general, on average, students are less stressed when they do this. Students are more caught up. They're able to get assignments in on time. They're able to build on their knowledge. Because when you start getting behind, especially in psych classes, when we're learning really new information that builds on each other, and a lot of other kind of courses are like this. Some math courses is like that. Lots of different courses build on the material. In some cases, you might have something like a history class where you're talking about one period of time and the next period of time doesn't really build on it. But for most classes, we're building knowledge as we go through a semester. So how much time should you study or read or write or work in one sitting? So I've been sitting here making this recording for, I can actually check right now, looks like 25 minutes. So, and I can tell for myself that my brain is starting to drift a little more, get a little more distracted, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Everybody's a little different here. So how much time do you think, just knowing yourself, do you think you can do like a sit down at my computer, work on this paper, or read for this assignment? How much time should you be doing one sitting of work? So write it down in your notes, think about it for a second. What has worked for you in the past? So cognitive psychology has studied lots of people. So neurotypical people, neurodivergent people, people with ADHD, people with autism, all sorts of ranges of how brains work, essentially, and found that on average, people in general do better when they have a consecutive study session of about 20 to 45 minutes. So work sections of 20 to 45 minutes are about what you should be planning for. So if you know you have an exam coming up, you might have multiple of those sections for one class or for a paper or something like that. But in general, our brains do a better job processing information in 20 to 45 minute chunks. And depending on you yourself, you might be able to get to that 45-minute mark, be totally fine, be able to remember a lot of things that you just studied. For me, myself, I just mentioned it's been about 25 minutes. I find 20 to 30 minutes tends to be my limit. If I get in a state of flow, I can go a little longer. But in general, about 20 to 30 minutes is where I'm at. So I'm not surprised at all that I saw it was exactly 25 minutes. That's about when I kind of set my timer. Sometimes I actually use a physical timer to say, hey, work for 25 minutes and then take a break. So figure out which, within that range, start within that range, because it's very, very rare for people to very consistently, for subject matter, for a lot of different work topics, to be able to go past 45 minutes. Your brain just works better in these kinds of chunks. So we've learned it from people that are neurotypical, neurodivergent, and that's the range, about 20 to 45 minutes. So with that being said, after that work section, so if I was to take a break right now, pause the video recording, go take a break, I don't think I'm going to, which maybe I should actually. Actually, to be a better example, I will. I will pause the video recording, I will go and take a 4-minute break, and then I will come back and continue the video recording. But after your section of work time, so let's say it's a 30-minute span of work, take a 4 or 5-minute break. If it's a 20-minute span of work, take a 3 or 4-minute break. If it's a 45-minute span of work, take a 7 or 8-minute break. So we'll talk about breaks specifically after I take a break. And I'll talk about what I did on my break and how it's relevant to what you should be doing on your break as well. All right, I am back. I was just on a break for about 5 minutes. So with this, I have now been working for about 30 minutes. I just took a 5-minute break. That tends to work really well for me, depending on what I'm doing, whether it's that I'm writing a paper or I'm grading. Actually, for grading, I often go like to 20 minutes and then I take a short break and then I come back and grade for maybe another 20 minutes and then I change to a completely different task. But for creating a lecture, I'll do a couple sections of about 30 minutes of work on creating a lecture. So with this, take in between that 25 and 45 minutes and then take a 3 to 7 or 8 minute break. So the longer your work section is, the longer your break should or can be. The shorter your work section is, the shorter your break should or can be. So what should you be doing on a break? Well, it should be something very, very different than your work tasks. The more different it is, the better it is. It kind of resets your brain, it lets you focus on new things. Another thing that we've learned from cognitive psychology is that we remember the first and last thing really well. So the first thing in a lecture, the last thing in a lecture, we tend to learn those better. So you're kind of giving yourself these study chunks another first and last thing to do with less in between if you take shorter times. So when you're doing something very different, your brain is processing that very differently. So let's say I'm here, I'm recording a lecture, or I'm making a lecture, I'm writing a paper, I'm doing grading. So I'm sitting here at my computer. A lot of your work is probably, a lot of your schoolwork at least, is probably sitting at your computer exactly where you are right in this minute. So for a break, I have a couple choices. I could turn off my recording, open up YouTube, watch a video on the most recent motorcycle I'm interested. I'll watch a couple reviews, maybe some funny cat videos. That's kind of a different task, right? I'm watching motorcycle content or cat videos. That's not psychology, that's not teaching. Or maybe I would take a break and answer emails. Maybe I heard the notification and so I go and answer emails on my break. Both of those are bad. Breaks, essentially. When my work is sitting here at the computer, doing a break at the computer is really a poor decision because my brain doesn't get as much of a break. I'm still doing physically very similar tasks. I'm still opening up windows, looking at screens, whether I'm answering emails, which is not a break. Answering emails is not a break. That's work. Watching a YouTube video is kind of a break, but I'm still doing a lot of the same tasks that I'm doing in this work. Right now, I'm creating a video. So watching a video is not that much different. So your break should be very different from your tasks. So what did I do on my break just now? I went and I did the dishes. So I saw that the clean dishes had not been done by me this morning, so I put the clean dishes away. So that was a very different task. My cat was meowing at me. I couldn't figure out why it was crying so much, so I gave it some pets, and I think that's what it wanted because now it's not hovering around my feet asking for more pets. So I pet my cat. I considered going out and getting the garbage cans in because I heard as I was recording a minute ago, I heard the garbage trucks go by. So I didn't actually do that, but those are very different. I'm getting up, I'm moving around. So if your work is moving around, doing something physical, let's say you're working in construction or you're making a garden and you're doing that for 45 minutes. Get up, go somewhere else, rest, right? If you're doing something physical, sit down. If you're doing something like I'm doing right now, sitting at a computer, move away from that space. So even if you're not like up and active or running about, if you're moving away from where you are for your break, doing something very different, that is going to be good. So the more different it is, the better, and then you get a new first and last point in your next study session. When you come back from your break, another really good tip is we like novel things, we remember novel things better. So let's say you're studying for one topic or one class, this class, and you've done that for about 30 minutes. You take a break, come back and study for another class that's very, very different, can really help because it won't kind of mix your knowledge from that section of studying of 30 minutes to that new section of 30 minutes studying. So let's take, for example, if I'm in a research methods class learning about running statistics, and I also have a math class that semester, studying that statistics with math and then doing a math class after my break, a lot of that information is going to start getting muddied in my brain. Just that's the way we do it. We'll make connections between those things, and that can be useful, but it's not as useful as switching to a completely different subject. So let's say you're studying for a math class, then switch completely, study for a history class. You're studying psychology, don't switch to studying sociology, switch to studying something completely different. So those are another couple tips for managing your times and using study sessions really well. So if I'm studying psychology or reading psych papers for 30 minutes, then I come back and I start reading sociology papers, that information is going to mix together in my brain. So studying completely different things after your break is a really good idea. For me, I want to get this task done, so I'm guessing this will be my last half-hour session for making this one recording. Then I'll switch to another task. Maybe my next 20 minutes will be answering emails, grading papers, those kinds of things, rather than doing more lecture recordings. So with this, when we're spacing out our learning, when we're taking breaks, when we're doing it over multiple days, it really helps our brain remember things, make connections better, and reduce that forgetting curve. That's kind of this whole point of all of these tips, is to maximize the potential of your neurons and your brain to remember things. So here's the forgetting curve again, in case you forgot it. You've got, within the first hour or so, you forgot about 50% of the things you take in. So if we review day by day, so this is the day we read the book, this is the day we have lecture, then we review our notes a couple days later, you see the slope of that line. You don't forget nearly as much, and it takes a lot longer to forget. And remember, if you're remembering something for 20 or 30 days, you're probably going to continue remembering that for years. That's just how long-term memory works. Essentially, you're taking this stuff that you're getting in that 30-minute study session, and you're trying to put more of it into your long-term memory with good note-taking, with making connections to yourself, with making things meaningful. Those are ways to put things into long-term memory. So we can also use other retrieval cues, which are really interesting. So I mentioned the retrieval cues of when you're writing a note, you can remember where you physically put that on a piece of paper. We can use other kinds of retrieval cues. I mentioned our other senses are involved in memories. Smells, sights, sounds. These are all cued within our memory. You might be walking through a mall or something, and you smell a scent coming from a store, and you're like, oh, I remember my first partner wore that scent as a perfume or a cologne, and then it brings back memories of that person. You might have had that kind of experience. Or maybe you had a dog that was really stinky, and that dog passed away a few years ago. You smell another dog that smells really similar, like, oh, this reminds me of my dog. I'm sure some dogs don't smell stinky. I've only ever had cats. They tend to be really clean. So sorry to any dog people that I just offended. I'm sure your dogs are fantastic. But the point is, certain things like a certain sound or a certain smell or a certain sight can cue those memories. We can use that to capitalize on how we remember things, to learn and remember things from a class or from a work meeting or from learning a new skill. So we can use context clues. We have here this might look similar to where you're studying and working right now, or maybe this does. Maybe you are in a public area, a library, a coffee shop, something like that. Maybe this is what it looks like where you are studying right now for this class. Maybe it's a quieter place, a home office, a corner in your room, something like that, a corner in your house where you're doing your work. So that place is putting in information to connect to the material you're learning. So if you always sit at the same desk in a classroom, that desk and the way you see things from that position in a classroom will be tied to your memories. So seeing the board in a specific way, seeing the slideshow in a specific way, sitting at your table, looking at your screen. And you can see how if you're always at the same table, always at the same place for all of your classes, it can kind of maybe muddy your experience between your classes. But it can also help you recall things as well. So if you are using the same desk in the same position in the same place at your home, that can be helpful in recalling things in the future. So switching up locations can give your brain a variety of context clues to then recall things. So let's say you wanted to study for psychology in your living room, you wanted to study for math in your bedroom, you wanted to study for some other class in a coffee shop. Taking tests in those locations for those specific classes would give you a boost. But if you then, what did I say, bedroom for studying psychology? If you tried to take your math test from your bedroom, you wouldn't have those context retrieval One thing that you could do, I've never actually heard of a study trying to do this, but this would be really interesting if you wanted to try it yourself. You could have, say, certain scents. Maybe you're smelling pumpkin spice when you are studying psychology. Maybe you are smelling a spring-scented candle when you're studying math. You could actually do that and give yourself those retrieval cues. And when you're doing the math test, have that spring-scented candle going. That could literally help your brain recall memories that you wouldn't necessarily be able to recall otherwise. I mentioned scent because it's one of the strongest senses tied to memory. We do a lot with our visual system, but scent seems to really, really well tie to memories. So if you always studied in the same place, took tests in the same locations, that could be a benefit. So for a lot of you, that might work out really well. Maybe you're studying from home, maybe on your couch, or at a desk or something like that, and you're always in the same place. That can be really helpful because that specific location is helping you with your retrieval cues. So, other things that are in the book, I just wanted to go through these really quickly. Always attending class. We mentioned how sometimes I didn't attend class in my freshman year, and it made it so it was harder to remember things because I didn't cover it multiple times. Schedule time for covering content for your classes or working. Write down things that are important. Schedule out dates for when papers are coming up. Plan ahead to be working on. I have to find the research for my research paper. I have to start writing a draft, those kinds of things. So give yourself additional deadlines. So some professors do a really good job of this. Some don't do as good of a job of this. I try to put a lot of kind of deadlines in a line for, say, a really big end of the year paper so that you're working on it consistently over time. But you can even break that up on your own into smaller chunks too. So start assignments early. Remember, it tends to take more time than you expect to do things. When you get tired, if you've only been studying 15 minutes and you usually study 30 minutes, it's okay to take a break at that point. If you can tell you're not focusing well, that kind of thing, take a break. That's all right. If you generally study for 45 minutes and you've only made it to 30 minutes, that's okay. Take a break. You can have some adjustment within the schedule. You don't have to stick 100% to it as long as you're making sure you're doing well for your brain. And celebrate your achievements. So do really well on a test. You finish studying for a test, go get ice cream, or don't forget to feed yourself. I mentioned sleep earlier, but also don't forget to feed yourself. Drink water. Celebrate by playing with your dog, something like that, right? So review things. When you're focusing on, say, studying for an exam, you will have already read the book, attended class, hopefully reviewed your notes at least once. Now as you go to sit down studying for a test, there might be a lot of things now, since you've covered that material multiple times, that you're like, oh yeah, I remember this stuff. I already remember this whole page of notes. Well, don't spend extra time studying that whole page of notes. Focus on the things as you look at it, you're like, I don't remember this at all. Focus on that. Re-review that. Add more examples. You might even need to go back to the book. So review the things that you are struggling with. If you already know that you remember it, don't spend as much time on it. So with this, for test taking specifically, there's additional tips as you're prepping for doing a test. And a lot of these apply for multiple choice, essay questions, all sorts of tests. So look over the exam before answering questions. So whether it's a writing exam, whether it's a multiple choice, read through all of the questions, skim everything before answering anything. Depending on what works for you, you might want to start with the easy questions, or you might want to start with the hard questions. You might want to start with the essay questions, or you might want to start with the multiple choice questions. I like to start with easy questions, and I like to start with essay questions. So if I have a test with both multiple choice and essay, I will often, especially with essay at least, I will go through and write a small outline for any of my essay questions, and then I'll start with the easy ones, so then I know, oh, I've got a really good answer there, I'll fill that in, and generally I can do it pretty quickly because it's easier for me, and then I'll move to the harder questions. Some people like doing that opposite. They might want to get all the multiple choice done first and then the essay. They might want to start with the hard questions. When I'm doing a multiple choice test, I like to also do the easy questions first and then the hard questions, but figure out what works for you. Which do you like to do better? And you'll have multiple classes to practice that with. So with this, do read all the options for multiple choice questions. Sometimes the wording that I use in my answers is intentionally very specific so that one answer is right, but the other answer might look like it's right. So make sure you're reading all the options. If C looks like it's right, but D was the correct answer, but you never read D, you might mark C and have never read D on that, even though D was the actual correct answer. So make sure you understand the question. If two answers seem correct, reread. You might have misread something. Additional answers later on in the test might also prime your memory for things that you answered before. So that's another good reason to read everything in the exam, because it can remind you of things from before. So feel free, especially in the tests how I set them up, you're able to like jump back and forth, flag answers. So you can skip maybe number 6 and number 12 if you didn't know. So flag those, skip them. Maybe after you answer number 20, you're like, oh yeah, of course, this is what number 6 was. You can go back to that and do that. So some classes that might not be allowed, so you might not be able to use that strategy, but it's a good test taking tip. For essay questions specifically, make sure you read the question fully, set the pencil down, think about your response, then make an outline for your response. So whether that's just a couple bullet points, whether that's a sentence you thought would be really good in answering the question, maybe your thesis statement for your response. And then after doing that, after having a plan and a little bit written down, then write your response. Answer the question specifically as well. This is one thing I see as an instructor, is if a student doesn't know the answer to the question very well, they will try to kind of put out everything they understand around that topic, hoping that they'll get some points. And sometimes they do, but oftentimes their train of thought as they try to talk all around this topic actually leads them in a way that didn't answer the question at all and ends up not getting very many points. So don't just deliver everything you know about a topic. Really try to answer the specific question. So and consider your time. So if you know a question is going to take you a longer time to write, maybe start with that one. If you know it's going to be really quick to answer that, maybe do that one first. You've got to decide what you want to do. So plan that out as you start taking an exam. So, memory study tips. Some of these we've talked about. This is kind of a review for this chapter. So with this, review your notes routinely. So a day after, a couple days after class, review those notes. Check for any errors that you made in your notes originally. Include more points, more examples. Arrange your notes into memorable structures. Some people like to take out sections and literally paste the paper in different orders. That's fine. Experiment with a variety of techniques in your note writing. Hierarchies, networks, analogies to familiar things. So hierarchies is like, this is like most important, or this is like a major topic, this is subtopics. A network is like, oh, this concept is connected to this concept, is connected to this concept. I've had colleagues that literally draw like on big whiteboards how concepts are connected to each other in networks, and that really works for them. That doesn't work for me. I don't like doing that. But it could work for you, so try it out. Analogies to familiar things works really well for most people, so it helps connect it to other memories that you have in your brain already. Give your undivided attention during that 20 to 45 minute study session. Try to have a minimize distractions. Don't have that email notification pull you over to other work, or your text notification pull you over to text. Obviously, if there's an emergency, you want to respond to that. But do try to give yourself undivided attention time during that study session. So try to process the material deeply, making connections to yourself, connecting concepts to other concepts, make associations, use imagery. So I'm a very visual person when I'm thinking of like how neural anatomy works. So that kind of imagery can really help. Or imagining a scenario where people are interacting, and say when we're talking about a research method. So how does a case study work? I might imagine like a scene of a case study happening. So encode early and often. So use these tips to encode those memories early and often. So rehearsing is redoing your notes, talking to others, quizzing yourself. You might even find online quizzes for various textbooks from various publishers. Sometimes they have, let's say, like a pre-test quiz. I often give study guides that have a couple of the questions that you might see on an exam. So have other people in a study group give you their notes or share their notes or talk about their notes or give you a quiz. Ask yourself questions. Essay questions are going to be the best if you're trying to make a question. Oftentimes I'll do, say, a discussion board assignment where you make a multiple choice question. But when you're trying to study and rehearse things, essay questions are going to be best. So how are case studies done? So what would be the process of doing a case study? And then answering that to yourself. So rest and eat well before doing an exam, before classes, just in general for life. Rest and eat well. It really helps with a lot of things. And take breaks during your study. So this first and last thing, that's called the primacy and recency effect. So get that working for you. So keep comfortable and calm. I know when I go over about that 30-minute mark of my studying, I get a little more agitated. I'm like, oh, I want to get this task done. I might feel like I've only got 10 minutes left of it. It's better for me to take that break and come back to it than try to push through. So being more calm, having that primacy and recency effect, having that break in between, it really helps brains work better to stay with less anxiety, even though it's like, oh, I really want to get this done so I can move on to the next thing, or I know I have a deadline for this other class, or I have to get to work, and I want to finish this chapter reading. Try to keep that anxiety level down and follow these tips. So remember, this is all to help your brain work better to remember things. Human brains are really remarkable in how much they can remember, and we can use these tips to remember a lot more. So whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, these tips can work for you. Some of them might not work for you specifically, but a combination of these will work for you. So figure out what works for you. Use it in all your classes, not just this class, and you'll do really well in all your material. So as a reminder, 20 to 45 minute sections of study and intense work, and then 3 to 7 minute break sessions. That should be different breaks and come back to a new different task if you can. So, and then that is for later on this week. So that is the study tips. Hopefully it's really useful. We'll talk about these things as we go along in class as well. A lot of them are really relevant to all of your different classes. So hopefully you learned a little bit about cognitive psychology, a little bit more about how your brain works, and a little bit more about how to use your brain to remember things really, really well.